The phone vibrated at 11:17 p.m. Not the main phone, the encrypted one. The black device that sat on the mahogany desk like a loaded weapon, used only for two things: ordering executions and confirming bodies. So when the screen lit up with a string of crying emojis and a photograph, Nino Valentin didn't move. He stared. The message was simple, desperate. "Please, Daddy, come home. They are beating my mama." Below it, a blurry photo. A little girl in a yellow dress, tears streaking down her flushed cheeks, blonde hair falling across terrified eyes. Nino's jaw tightened. Wrong number. Had to be. Some panicked kid mistyping in the dark. He almost deleted it. Almost. Then the second text arrived. "I'm hiding under my bed. I can hear her screaming. Please." Something in Nino's chest cracked. Not broke, he'd buried those pieces years ago, but cracked. He'd built an empire on fear, commanded armies of men who'd kill at his word, destroyed anyone who threatened his territory. But he had never seen a child beg a stranger because there was no one else left. His tattooed fingers moved across the screen. 3 words. That's all he typed. "I'm on my way." The silence in the penthouse shattered. His second in command, Marco, looked up from the corner where he'd been reviewing shipping manifests. "Boss, we have the Castellano meeting in 20 minutes. Nino didn't answer. He stood, buttoned his white shirt halfway, grabbed his coat from the leather chair. The ink across his neck and chest caught the lamplight, a map of violence. A resume written in scars and symbols. "Boss, where are you going?" Still nothing. Because there was nothing to explain. Somewhere across the city, a little girl with a pink phone was hiding in the dark, and the only thing standing between her and whatever hell was unfolding was a wrong number that landed in the palm of the most dangerous man on the East Coast. His car roared to life in the underground garage. Midnight streets blurred past. Another text lit up the passenger seat. "I hear footsteps outside my door." "Please hurry, Daddy." Nino's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. His pulse, a sound he rarely noticed anymore, hammered against his ribs. City lights streaked like tracer fire. By the time he pulled up to the address his tech guy had traced, Nino already knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't arriving as the shadow of the East Coast tonight. He wasn't arriving as a mob boss, a killer, or a ghost. He was arriving as the only hope that little girl in the yellow dress had left. And what Nino walked into that apartment would haunt him for the rest of his life, but not in the way you'd expect. Stay with me until the end, because what happens when Nino Valentin kicks down that door will restore your faith in justice. Before we find out what Nino did next, welcome back to the channel. Don't forget to comment down below where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We love seeing our global community light up the comments. Now, let's get into the story. 20 minutes earlier, Nino had been alone. The penthouse office sat 60 floors above the city, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering chaos below. Millions of people, millions of problems, none of them his concern. That's how he'd survived this long, by caring about nothing except control, territory, and the next threat to eliminate. The whiskey decanter sat untouched on the bar cart. He didn't drink when he worked, and he was always working. Tonight's agenda: review 3 hit lists, approve 2 shipments, and finalize a deal that would expand his reach into the Gong district. He wore his uniform, crisp white button-down, sleeves rolled to reveal the intricate ink that crawled from his wrists to his shoulders. The tattoos told a story he never spoke aloud. A saint's face on his right forearm, a fallen angel on his left, a rosary wrapped around his throat like a noose. On his chest, over his heart, a single name in script, surrounded by thorns. Lucia, his daughter, dead at 7. The same age as the girl on the phone. Nino Valentin had built walls around that wound, mortared them with violence and silence. Emotions were weaknesses, connections were liabilities. The moment you cared about something, the world could take it from you. So he'd stopped caring, stopped feeling, became the ghost everyone whispered about but no one ever saw coming. Until tonight. Until a little girl with a pink phone and a typo cracked those walls wide open. He stood now at the window, one hand pressed against the cold glass, the phone still glowing in his other hand. Behind him, Marco shifted nervously. The Castellano family would be furious about the missed meeting. There'd be consequences, explanations demanded, respect questioned. Nino didn't care. For the first time in a decade, something mattered more than the empire. A child was in danger, and he was the only one who could save her. Now, let's begin the story. The phone call lasted exactly 47 seconds. Nino didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't explain, didn't ask permission. He simply said the name that made grown men check their surroundings before responding. Dante, I need you. Now. On the other end of the line, Dante Caruso, a 26-year-old genius who'd been hacking Pentagon servers at 14 before Nino recruited him with a choice between employment and a shallow grave, knew better than to ask questions when the boss used that tone. I'm listening. I'm sending you screenshots of 2 text messages. Unknown number. I need the exact location of the phone that sent them. Not the cell tower. Not the neighborhood. The exact address. You have 3 minutes. A pause. The sound of fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. Boss. Triangulating a civilian phone without 2 minutes and 40 seconds. On it. Nino paced the length of his office. The phone pressed so hard against his ear that his knuckles ached. Outside the windows, the city sprawled in all its oblivious glory, a million lights, a million lives, all of them continuing while somewhere in that concrete maze, a child was suffocating on her own terror. He'd built this empire on knowing things, on having eyes everywhere, on being 3 steps ahead of every threat. But right now, with that little girl's face burned into his mind, all his power felt like nothing more than expensive furniture and empty promises. The encrypted phone buzzed again. Another message. He broke Mama's arm. I heard it snap. Nino's vision tunneled. His free hand curled into a fist, the tattooed knuckles whitening. Somewhere in his chest, in that dead space where Lucia's memory lived, something ancient and furious stirred. He'd spent years perfecting his control, his stillness, his ability to watch men plead for their lives without blinking. But this was different. This wasn't business. This wasn't territory or respect, or the careful chess game of organized crime. This was a child watching her mother being destroyed. Dante, talk to me. Working on it, boss. The phone's got location services disabled, but she sent a photo. Photos contain metadata GPS coordinates embedded in the file. I'm extracting it now, but the signal's bouncing through 3 different towers. Whoever's place this is, they're in a dead zone. Poor cellular coverage. I don't care if she's texting from hell itself. Find her. More typing. Dante's breathing had gone sharp, focused. He knew what was riding on this. In the background, Nino could hear the hum of multiple monitors, the whir of processors being pushed to their limits. Every second stretched like broken glass. Got it. 1847 Riverside Avenue, Unit 3C, East Side, near the Industrial District. Boss, that's Silas Thorne's territory. Nino was already moving, grabbing his keys, his coat. Who? Loan shark, mid-level operator, runs a crew of debt collectors, enforcers who specialize in intimidation, mostly single mothers, people who can't fight back, real bottom feeders. Word is they don't just collect, they make examples. They send everything you have on him to my phone. I want his crew list, his known associates, and every property he operates out of. Now, boss, shouldn't we call the cops? I mean, domestic violence, child in danger they'd have to respond to. Nino stopped in the doorway of his office. The city lights cast his shadow long and sharp across the marble floor. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decade of bodies and broken promises. Dante, how long would it take for patrol to respond to that address? A hesitation. Then, quietly, average response time for that district is 43 minutes. Longer if it's a domestic call. They prioritize based on 43 minutes. She doesn't have 43 minutes. Nobody does when Silas Thorne decides to make an example. Nino's jaw set. Send me the information. Then erase every trace of this call from your system. This conversation never happened. Understood. Boss? What? Be careful. Silas runs with at least 4 guys on collection nights. They're sloppy, but they're armed. Nino almost smiled. Almost. So am I. He ended the call and stood there for a moment in the threshold, the encrypted phone in one hand, his car keys in the other. Behind him, the office represented everything he'd built, the empire, the fear, the carefully constructed legend of the shadow of the East Coast. Ahead of him lay the elevator, the garage, the streets, and whatever waited at 1847 Riverside Avenue. Nino could have ignored the text, could have deleted it, blocked the number, gone back to his whiskey and his hit lists. Could have told himself it wasn't his problem, that the world was full of tragedies he couldn't fix, that one wrong number didn't obligate him to anything. But he didn't, because somewhere between the first crying emoji and the photo of that little girl in the yellow dress, between the second text and the third, something had shifted. Maybe it was Lucia's ghost whispering in the space behind his ribs. Maybe it was the recognition that his entire empire was built on the principle that power meant something, and if it didn't mean protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, then what the hell was it all for? If you believe that real strength means standing up for those who can't fight back, hit that subscribe button. Only cowards and bystanders will scroll past. The elevator descended. 60 floors between heaven and hell. By the time the doors opened to the underground garage, Nino Valentin had already made his choice. Tonight, the Empire would wait. The meetings would be rescheduled. The Castellanos would be offended. None of it mattered. Because at 1847 Riverside Avenue, Unit 3C, a 7-year-old girl was hiding under a bed with a pink phone and zero hope left, except for the 3 words he'd sent her. I'm on my way. And Nino Valentin always kept his promises, especially to the dead. Especially to little girls in yellow dresses who reminded him of everything he'd lost and everything he'd failed to save. The engine roared to life. The Audi R8 tore through the midnight streets like a bullet seeking flesh. Nino's hands gripped the steering wheel with the same controlled precision he used for everything measured, deliberate, lethal, when necessary. But tonight, beneath that iron control, something wild clawed at his chest. Something he'd buried 9 years ago in a cemetery plot too small for the coffin it held. The city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow. Traffic lights became suggestions. Stop signs turned invisible. At this hour, the streets belonged to predators and prey, to addicts and insomniacs, to people like him who operated in the margins where law meant nothing and power meant everything. But tonight he wasn't hunting. Tonight he was racing against a clock that ticked in a child's panicked heartbeat. His phone lit up on the passenger seat. Another message from the unknown number. Are you really coming? My daddy never comes. Nino's throat constricted. His tattooed fingers trembled just barely, just enough that he noticed. He swerved around a taxi, cut through a red light at an intersection he'd controlled through bribes and bloodshed for the last 5 years. The phone's glow painted his face in cold blue light as he glanced at the words again. My daddy never comes. Of course he doesn't, Nino thought. Because daddies like that, the ones who left their daughters alone in apartments where loan sharks came calling. Where violence was a household sound as common as running water, those daddies never came. They were ghosts even when they were breathing. Phantoms who wore their failures like cologne, and left behind wreckage in the shape of little girls who had to beg strangers for salvation. Nino knew because he'd been that ghost once. Different circumstances, same sin. The memory hit him like a fist between the ribs. Unavoidable, unforgiving. Lucia. 7 years old. Dark curls that bounced when she laughed. A gap-toothed smile that could make him forget he was a monster. She'd called him Papa, not Daddy, because even at 7 she'd understood they came from somewhere that tasted different, spoke different, bled different. She'd been his entire world condensed into 3.5 feet of fearless joy, and he'd failed her. The night it happened, he'd been in a warehouse across town, mediating a dispute between 2 crews over territory he didn't even care about. Pointless posturing, meaningless pride. While he'd been playing king, while he'd been making men kneel and beg, his wife Maria had taken Lucia to the corner store for milk and bread. Simple, safe. A 10-minute errand in their own neighborhood, a neighborhood he'd supposedly made secure through fear and reputation. The Bratva had different ideas about security. They'd wanted to send a message about the East Coast belonging to new management, so they'd sent it in bullet casings and blood spray, in a little girl's body crumpling on a bodega floor, while her mother screamed prayers in Spanish that God didn't bother answering. By the time Nino arrived, the paramedics were already loading the small form into the ambulance. He'd known from 50 feet away, known from the way they moved without urgency, known from the sheet that covered everything, including her face. The Bratva crew responsible had vanished by sunrise, all 7 of them. Nino had found them one by one over the next 3 weeks and taught them the difference between sending a message and receiving one. But revenge was ash in his mouth, hollow, because no amount of blood could fill the space where his daughter's laughter used to live. Maria left him 6 months later, not because she blamed him, though she should have, but because looking at him reminded her of everything they'd lost. She'd moved to Florida, remarried a dentist, had 2 more children with a man who came home every night at 6, and whose worst crime was forgetting to take out the trash. Nino had stayed in the city, built his empire higher, colder, more untouchable, convinced himself that isolation was strength, that caring was weakness, that the only way to survive in this world was to become the thing everyone feared too much to challenge. Until tonight. Until a wrong number landed in his palm and showed him a little girl in a yellow dress who needed anyone to prove that not all the daddies disappear when the monsters come knocking. He typed back with one hand, the other steady on the wheel as he blew through another intersection. "I'm on my way. Stay hidden. Stay quiet. I promise I'm coming." The response came immediately. Promise? Such a small word. Such enormous weight. Nino had made 1,000 promises in his life to allies, to enemies, to ghosts. Most he'd kept. Some he'd broken. All of them had been transactions, negotiations, strategic commitments in a game where everyone played with loaded dice. But this was different. I promise. He pressed send and felt something crack open inside him, not the walls he'd built, but something deeper, the foundation itself. Because he'd made this promise before, hadn't he? To Lucia. Every morning when he'd kissed her forehead and told her Papa would keep her safe. Every night when he'd checked her closet for monsters that didn't exist while ignoring the real monster in the mirror. He'd promised her the world and delivered a casket. The GPS on his phone showed 8 minutes to Riverside Avenue. 8 minutes between intention and action. Between the man he'd become and the man he should have been. The industrial district rose around him, abandoned factories, crumbling apartments, streets where the city's failure collected like sediment at the bottom of a polluted river. This was Silas Thorne's kingdom, an empire built on desperation, where single mothers borrowed to feed their children and ended up paying with broken bones and shattered dignity, where men felt powerful because they could terrorize people who had nowhere else to turn. Nino's hands tightened on the wheel. The Audi's engine growled, a mechanical promise of violence deferred but not forgotten. He couldn't save Lucia, couldn't rewind 9 years and choose differently, couldn't unmake the decision to attend that worthless meeting while his daughter bought milk in what should have been the safest 10 blocks in the city. But he could save this one. This girl in the yellow dress with the pink phone and the terrified texts. This one, he could reach in time. The speedometer climbed, buildings blurred. The city held its breath. And somewhere ahead, in Unit 3C at 1847 Riverside Avenue, a little girl waited for a stranger to keep a promise her own father never could. Judy Nichols pressed herself against the wall under her bed, the pink phone clutched in both hands like a talisman against the dark. Her yellow dress, the one with the red flowers that Mama said made her look like sunshine, was bunched around her knees, the fabric damp with sweat and tears. The space smelled like dust and old shoes and the particular terror that only a 7-year-old hiding from monsters could produce. The phone screen illuminated her face in ghostly blue. 3 words glowed back at her. "I'm on my way." Her breath hitched. A stranger. Some man whose number she'd typed wrong because her hands were shaking so badly she'd hit a 7 instead of a 6. She didn't know who he was. Didn't know if he was real or just another grown-up lie. Another promise that would dissolve like the ones her daddy made every Sunday when he called drunk from whatever city he'd run to this time. But he'd said he was coming, and that was more than anyone else had offered. In the living room beyond her bedroom door, the sounds had changed. The screaming had stopped not because things were better, but because Mama's voice had gone hoarse, reduced to wet, gasping sobs that made Judy's stomach hurt in ways she didn't have words for. The men's voices rumbled like thunder, casual, almost bored, like breaking someone was just another Thursday night task to check off a list. "That's the 3rd installment you've missed, Elena." The voice belonged to Silas Thorne, though Judy didn't know his name. She only knew his voice, smooth, cold, like oil poured over ice. "We've been patient. More than fair. But my investors, they're not as understanding as I am. Please." Mama's voice cracked. "I get paid Friday. 2 more days. I'll have half of it by then, I swear." The sound of a slap. Sharp, final. Judy flinched under the bed, pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. "Half isn't whole, Elena. Half is still failure. And we don't accept failure." Judy stared at her phone. At the 3 words, "I'm on my way." She wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that somewhere in the city, someone was actually coming. But grown-ups lied. They promised things and then they left. They said they loved you and then they disappeared. They said they'd protect you and then they got hurt because you needed milk and the bad men were faster than prayers. She typed back with trembling fingers. "Promise?" The response came in seconds. "I promise." 2 more words. Simple, direct. But something in those letters made Judy's chest feel less tight. She didn't know why she believed him. Maybe because strangers had less reason to lie than the people who were supposed to love you. Maybe because when you were 7 years old and hiding under a bed while your mother bled in the next room, you grabbed onto hope wherever you found it. Even if it came from a wrong number and a stranger's promise. She was still staring at the screen when the living room went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, wrong quiet. The kind of silence that meant someone had made a decision. Footsteps, heavy, purposeful, moving down the hallway, past the bathroom, past the closet where the water heater rattled. Toward her room, Judy's lungs stopped working. The phone screen dimmed, throwing her back into shadow. She could see the strip of light under her bedroom door, could see the darkness of feet blocking that light. 2 feet, one person, standing right there. The doorknob turned. She tried to make herself smaller, tried to disappear into the wall, into the carpet, into anywhere that wasn't here. Her yellow dress seemed to glow in the dark, a beacon advertising her location. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest. The door swung open. Light spilled in from the hallway, not bright, just the dim glow from the kitchen fixture that Mama kept on so Judy wouldn't be scared at night. Footsteps entered, slow, deliberate. The feet wore expensive shoes, leather, polished, completely wrong for this neighborhood, for this apartment, for this moment. "I know you're in here, little one." Silas Thorne's voice poured into the room like smoke. "I heard you earlier, crying, making phone calls." Judy's heart hammered so loud she was sure he could hear it. The phone was still in her hands, screen dark now, useless. She should text the stranger again, should tell him to hurry. But her fingers wouldn't move. Fear had turned her body into stone. The footsteps moved toward the bed. She could see his shoes now through the Gap black leather, spotless despite the building's dirty floors. They stopped right at the edge of her hiding place. "Your mama owes me a lot of money she doesn't have. So I'm thinking maybe we need to have a conversation about collateral, about value, about what happens when people don't pay their debts." A hand appeared, long fingers, gold rings on 3 of them. The hand reached down, grabbed the edge of the bed skirt. Judy squeezed her eyes shut, pressed herself against the wall. The stranger's words echoed in her head. "I'm on my way," but they felt distant now, as real as fairy tales, as useful as wishing on stars that didn't care. The bed skirt lifted. Light flooded her hiding place. And Silas Thorne's face appeared in the gap, thin, angular, with eyes that didn't blink enough. He smiled when he saw her, a smile that had nothing to do with kindness, and everything to do with predators finding prey exactly where they expected. "There you are," he said softly. "Come out, sweetheart. Let's talk about what your mama owes me." Judy couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at this man who'd hurt her mother and was now reaching for her with those ringed fingers, those manicured hands that looked like they'd never worked a day but had somehow broken everything they touched. "I said come out." The smile vanished. The hand reached farther, grabbed her ankle. She screamed. And in that scream was every ounce of terror, every moment of helplessness, every broken promise from every absent father, every night spent listening to her mother cry over bills they couldn't pay, and choices that led here, to this room, to this moment, to this monster's hand wrapped around her ankle, pulling her out from under the only shelter she had left. The pink phone fell from her hands, skittered across the floor. The screen lit up one more time with a new message. But Judy couldn't see it anymore. The Audi R8 looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in a junkyard. Nino killed the engine in front of 1847 Riverside Avenue and sat for exactly 3 seconds, taking in the landscape of human failure that surrounded him. Broken streetlights, graffiti tags layered so thick they'd become abstract art, windows covered with cardboard and duct tape. A shopping cart on its side in the middle of the street, one wheel still spinning lazily in the night breeze. This was the bottom. The place where the city's promise dissolved into concrete dust and broken dreams, where single mothers worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep the wolves from the door, where children learned early that safety was a luxury their zip code couldn't afford. Nino stepped out of the car, his Italian leather shoes hitting pavement that was more pothole than road. The contrast was obscene. His custom-tailored suit probably cost more than 6 months' rent in this building. The watch on his wrist could feed every family on this block for a year. He was money and power made flesh, standing in a place where both were myths people told themselves to get through another day. He didn't lock the car. If someone was stupid enough to steal from him, they'd learn a lesson more expensive than the vehicle's value. The apartment building loomed above him, 6 stories of decay, each floor a testament to civic neglect and systematic abandonment. Fire escapes hung at drunken angles. The front door's security lock had been busted for so long the exposed wiring had rusted. In the windows, he could see the flickering blue glow of televisions, the occasional shadow of someone still awake at this godforsaken hour. 3rd floor. Unit 3C. Dante's information scrolled through his mind with the precision of a hit list. Silas Thorne. 4 associates. Debt collection in progress. Target. Elena Nichols. Single mother. Nurse's aide. Behind on a loan she'd taken to cover her daughter's medical bills after an asthma attack, landed them in the ER without insurance. The truly sick part? Nino knew people like Silas, had done business with them when it suited his purposes. They were bottom feeders in the criminal ecosystem, not important enough to eliminate, not problematic enough to notice. They operated in the margins, preying on people who couldn't fight back, careful never to attract attention from anyone who mattered. Tonight, Silas had attracted attention. Tonight, he mattered very much. Nino crossed the broken sidewalk, pushed through the building's front door into a lobby that smelled like mildew and desperation. The elevator had an out-of-order sign that looked older than some of the residents. He took the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. With each floor, the building's decay became more pronounced. Water stains on the walls, missing ceiling tiles, the persistent drip of a leak somewhere in the plumbing that nobody would ever fix. Second floor landing. He paused, checked his phone. No new messages from the girl. That could mean she was safe, hiding, staying quiet like he'd told her. Or it could mean something else. Third floor. The hallway stretched ahead, lit by a single functioning bulb that turned everything the color of old bruises. Apartment doors lined both sides, 2A through 2F on the left, 3A through 3F on the right. Most were silent. A few leaked sound-muffled television, a baby crying, someone's music playing too loud through walls too thin to contain anything, least of all privacy. Unit 3C was 4 doors down on the right. Nino moved toward it with the silent efficiency of a predator. His hand moved inside his jacket, found the Glock holstered against his ribs. He didn't draw it, not yet, but his fingers wrapped around the grip like greeting an old friend. The weight was comforting, familiar. A tool he'd used more times than he could count for purposes both necessary and vindictive. Tonight felt different. Tonight the gun wasn't for business. It was for something older than crime, something more fundamental than territory or profit. Tonight it was for justice. He was 3 steps from the door when he heard it. A child's scream, high-pitched, terrified, the sound of innocence encountering cruelty and not understanding why, not comprehending that the world could contain this much horror, that grown-ups could choose to hurt instead of protect. The scream cut through Nino's chest like a blade. Every instinct he'd honed over a decade of violence activated simultaneously. His hand drew the Glock. His body moved forward. The rational part of his brain, the part that usually calculated angles and exit strategies and consequences, went silent. There was only the scream. And the door. And the promise he'd made to a stranger with a pink phone and a yellow dress. He didn't knock. Didn't announce himself. Didn't give them the courtesy of warning. Nino Valentin raised his foot and kicked the door just below the lock with every ounce of controlled fury he possessed. The doorframe exploded inward, cheap wood splintering like kindling. The door slammed open with a sound like thunder contained in 12 square feet of particle board and broken promises. The apartment's interior revealed itself in snapshot clarity. A small living room, furniture that was old when it was bought secondhand. A woman, Elena, had to be on the floor near the couch, cradling her left arm at an angle that screamed broken. Blood on her lip, terror in her eyes. 2 men standing over her, their attention snapping toward the destroyed door. A third man by the hallway entrance, frozen mid-step. And through the hallway, in a room at the back, another scream. Smaller, more desperate. The girl. The men in the living room reached for weapons, guns tucked in waistbands, one pulling a knife from his boot. They were fast, experienced, comfortable with violence. Nino was faster. The Glock came up smooth, steady, an extension of his will made metal. His voice, when it emerged, carried the weight of every grave he'd filled, every promise he'd kept, every line he'd drawn in the blood and concrete of this city he'd claimed as his own. Silas Thorne, I'm here about a debt. The apartment froze. 5 seconds of perfect stillness where violence hung suspended like a held breath, where every person in that cramped living room recalibrated their understanding of the situation based on the man standing in the destroyed doorway. Nino Valentin filled the frame like a promise of reckoning. The hallway's sickly light backlit him, turning his silhouette into something carved from shadow and intent. His white shirt still crisp despite the midnight drive, despite the stairs, despite everything caught what little illumination existed and threw it back like a challenge. The tattoos crawling up his neck seemed to move in the flickering light, serpents and saints dancing across skin that had seen more violence than most men witnessed in nightmares. The Glock in his hand wasn't pointed at anyone yet. It didn't need to be. Its presence was statement enough. Silas Thorne straightened from where he'd been crouched by the hallway entrance. He was a tall man, thin in the way that spoke of nervous energy rather than discipline, with features that might have been handsome if they weren't arranged in an expression of perpetual contempt. His suit was expensive but poorly maintained, the kind of outfit bought to project success but worn by someone who didn't quite understand that real power never needed to announce itself. He looked at Nino. At the ruined door, at the gun. Then he laughed. The sound was wrong, too confident, too casual. The laugh of a man who'd spent so long terrorizing people without consequence that he'd forgotten consequences existed. His two associates near the couch tensed, hands hovering near their waistbands. But Silas waved them off with the lazy authority of someone who genuinely believed he controlled the situation. Well. Silas's voice dripped with amused condescension. The hero arrives. Let me guess, concerned neighbor? White knight syndrome? Or maybe you're the boyfriend Elena's been hiding from us? He glanced at Elena, still crumpled on the floor, clutching her broken arm. Elena, sweetheart, you didn't mention you had a friend with such dramatic entrance preferences. Nino said nothing. He stepped fully into the apartment, his movements economical, precise. The door swung shut behind him, or tried to, catching on its broken frame and hanging at a drunken angle. His eyes swept the room with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd walked into 100 situations like this and walked out of all of them. Elena on the floor. Broken arm, split lip, eyes wide with a terror that was being rapidly replaced by confusion. Two men by the couch, mid-30s, the build of guys who worked out just enough to intimidate civilians but would fold against anyone who actually knew violence. One had a gun halfway out of his waistband. The other held a knife like he'd seen it done in movies but never actually used it for anything more serious than opening packages. And Silas, still smiling, still convinced this was theater he controlled. The third man who'd been in the hallway had disappeared, presumably still in Judy's room. Nino's jaw tightened. Every second that child was alone with a predator was a second too long. You must be new to this neighborhood, Silas continued, circling slowly, hands clasped behind his back like a professor delivering a lecture. Because if you knew how things worked around here, you'd understand that this is a private business matter. Elena and I have an arrangement. She borrowed money. She failed to repay according to our terms. Now we're discussing consequences and collateral. He gestured vaguely toward the hallway, toward where Judy's scream still echoed in the walls. Family assets, you might say. The casual cruelty in his tone, the way he reduced a terrified child to a balance sheet entry, landed in the room like a physical thing. Elena sobbed. A wet, broken sound. The two associates shifted nervously, finally sensing something their boss seemed blind to. The absolute stillness radiating from the stranger in the doorway. Nino's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. Quiet the way a blade was quiet before it cut. Where's the girl? Silas blinked. Excuse me? The girl. In the yellow dress. The one your associate is currently terrorizing in the back bedroom. Where is she? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Silas's face just for a moment. Just long enough to betray that his confidence was constructed rather than earned. Like I said, friend, private business. I suggest you turn around, walk back out that broken door, and forget you saw anything here tonight. Otherwise what? Not a question, a dare. Silas's smile hardened. He nodded to his two associates. Otherwise, my colleagues will escort you out in pieces. Tony, Marco, show our guest how we handle interruptions. The two men moved forward, pulling their weapons fully now. The one with the gun, Tony aimed it at Nino's chest with the overconfident stance of someone who'd never been shot back at. Marco advanced with his knife held low, the way amateurs always did, telegraphing every intention. Silas is the kind of guy who feels big making women and children cry. The kind who builds his entire existence on the backs of people who can't fight back, who measures his worth in the tears of single mothers and the terror of little girls in yellow dresses. We all know someone like that, the coward who mistakes cruelty for strength, who confuses fear with respect. If you can't stand bullies who prey on the weak, smash that like button right now to show you're not on their side. Tony's finger tightened on the trigger. Marco took another step forward. Silas watched from his safe distance, arms crossed, already composing the story he'd tell about the idiot who'd tried to play hero in the wrong apartment. Nino's expression didn't change. He'd been in this exact situation more times than he could count, men with guns who didn't know how to use them. Men with knives who'd never felt one slide between their ribs. Men like Silas who commanded violence but had never personally tasted it. What happened next would take less than 6 seconds. 6 seconds to dismantle the small empire of cruelty Silas Thorne had built in this forgotten neighborhood. 6 seconds to show him the difference between making people afraid and actually being dangerous. But before those 6 seconds began, before the violence erupted like a storm that had been gathering since the first text message landed on an encrypted phone, Nino said one more thing. His voice carried across the room with the finality of a casket being lowered into ground, with the certainty of consequences that had been earned and could no longer be avoided. I made a promise to that little girl, and I always keep my promises. Then the storm broke. Tony fired first. The gunshot cracked through the apartment like the world splitting open, deafening in the confined space. The bullet went wide 6 inches to Nino's left because Tony had made the fatal mistake of aiming before his hands stopped shaking, of pulling the trigger before his brain caught up to the fact that the man in the doorway hadn't even flinched. Nino moved. Not rushed, not panicked. Just moved with the fluid economy of someone for whom violence was a language spoken since childhood, a dialect he'd perfected in back alleys and warehouse floors, and expensive penthouses where men begged for mercy that never came. He closed the distance to Tony in 3 steps. The Glock in his own hand came up not to shoot but to strike a brutal arc that connected with Tony's jaw with the sound of a bat hitting wet concrete. Teeth and blood sprayed. Tony's gun clattered to the floor as his body followed, crumpling like a puppet with cut strings. He hit the stained carpet and didn't move, his jaw hanging at an angle that would require surgical wire to fix. 1 second elapsed. Marco lunged with the knife. A wild slash aimed at Nino's ribs. It was a good attack by civilian standards, fast, committed, the kind of move that would work on someone untrained, someone who froze when steel flashed in dim light. Nino caught Marco's wrist mid-strike. His grip was iron, his fingers finding pressure points with surgical precision. Marco's hand spasmed. The knife fell. Before it hit the ground, Nino's other hand, still holding the Glock, slammed into Marco's solar plexus with enough force to collapse both lungs simultaneously. Marco's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in a soundless scream as his diaphragm forgot how to function. Nino released him, and Marco folded in half, hitting his knees, his face turning the color of old newspaper. 3 seconds. The third associate, the one who'd been in the hallway with Judy, burst back into the living room. He was younger than the others, maybe 25, with the wild eyes of someone hopped up on something chemical and stupid. He had a gun too, a cheap 9mm that he held sideways like he'd learned to shoot from rap videos and bad movies. He fired twice. Both shots went high, punching holes in the ceiling, raining down plaster dust like toxic snow. His hands were shaking too badly, his fear overriding whatever artificial courage the drugs had provided. Nino didn't waste a bullet. He crossed the space between them, used the gun's weight to bat the 9mm aside, and drove his elbow into the kid's temple. The impact made a sound like a hammer on a melon. The kid's eyes rolled back and he dropped instantly, out cold before his body registered the command to fall. 5 seconds. Silas Thorne had backed against the far wall, his earlier confidence evaporating like water on hot asphalt. His hands were raised now, not in surrender but in that universal gesture of someone suddenly realizing they've miscalculated catastrophically. His mouth worked soundlessly, his brain trying to process how 3 armed men had been dismantled in less time than it took to microwave dinner. Nino turned to him. The Glock hung loose in his hand, pointing at the floor. He didn't need it anymore. Didn't need anything except his hands and the cold fury that had been building since the first text message, since the photograph of a little girl in a yellow dress, since the words "they are beating my mama" had landed in his world and cracked it open. You know what the problem with men like you is? Nino's voice was conversational, almost gentle. He stepped over Tony's unconscious form, his Italian shoes leaving prints in the blood and plaster dust. You mistake fear for respect. You think making someone cry makes you powerful. You spend your whole life hurting people who can't hurt you back, and you convince yourself that means you're strong. Silas pressed harder against the wall, as if he could somehow merge with the peeling paint and water-stained drywall. Look, whoever you are, whatever Elena told you, there's been a misunderstanding. We can work this out. I have money, connections. I can... Nino was in front of him before Silas finished the sentence. His left hand shot out, grabbed Silas by the throat, and slammed him back against the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. Silas's feet left the floor, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Nino's forearm, at the tattoos that crawled up toward his rolled sleeves like accusations made flesh. Which hand? Nino's voice was still quiet, still controlled, but underneath it ran a current of something ancient and merciless, something that had been waiting 9 years for permission to emerge. Which hand did you use to hit her? Silas's eyes were bulging, his face turning purple. He couldn't speak with Nino's hand crushing his windpipe, could only make desperate choking sounds. Nino loosened his grip just enough. Which hand? Right, Silas gasped. Right hand. Please, I didn't. I was just... Nino dropped him. Silas hit the floor hard, coughing, one hand going to his bruised throat. He was still gasping for air when Nino reached down and grabbed his right wrist with the same casual efficiency he'd shown disarming the others. "Wait." Silas's voice cracked. "Wait, please." Nino placed his foot on Silas's chest, pinning him to the floor. Then he pulled the wrist upward and brought his other hand down on Silas's elbow in a single, controlled motion. The joint hyperextended with a wet pop. Silas screamed, but Nino wasn't finished. He shifted his grip to Silas's hand, that manicured hand with its 3 gold rings, and began to bend the fingers backward one by one. The first finger broke with a sound like a dry branch snapping. Silas's scream went higher. The second finger followed, then the third. Nino worked with the methodical precision of a craftsman, ensuring each break was complete, ensuring the bones shattered in ways that would never quite heal right, that would ache every morning and serve as a permanent reminder of this moment. By the time he finished, Silas had passed out from the pain. His right hand hung at angles nature never intended, a ruined thing that would never again close into a fist, never again strike a woman holding her daughter's medical bills, never again terrorize anyone who couldn't fight back. Nino released the broken hand and stepped away. His breathing was barely elevated. His white shirt had a few spots of blood on it, Tony's. Mostly, but otherwise, he looked exactly as he had walking in, composed, in control. A man who'd done a necessary job and felt nothing about it except the satisfaction of completion. Elena was still on the floor near the couch, staring at him with an expression that mixed terror and awe and desperate gratitude. She opened her mouth to speak, but Nino raised a hand, silencing her gently. "Your daughter," he said. "Where?" Elena pointed toward the hallway with her good arm. "Last room. Please, is she?" Nino was already moving. He stepped over the unconscious bodies, navigated the narrow hallway, and stopped at the partially open door at the end. Inside, he could see the pink glow of a phone screen on the floor beside the bed, its light painting the dusty carpet in cotton candy colors. He bent down and picked it up. The screen showed his last message. "I promise." Nino stared at those 2 words for a long moment. Then he straightened, the phone still in his hand, and looked under the bed where a little girl in a yellow dress was pressed against the wall, her eyes wide, her small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Judy," he said quietly. "My name is Nino. I'm the one who texted you back. You're safe now. I kept my promise." Judy didn't move at first. She stayed pressed against the wall under her bed, the yellow dress bunched around her knees, her eyes fixed on the stranger who'd just spoken her name like he'd known it forever. The man was huge from her perspective, all white shirt and dark ink and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone by someone who'd forgotten to add softness. But his voice was gentle. The kind of gentle that didn't match the blood on his sleeves, or the gun still loose in his other hand, or the sounds of bodies hitting the floor that had echoed from the living room moments before. "It's okay," Nino said again, crouching down to make himself smaller, less threatening. He set the Glock on the floor, out of reach, a gesture of trust he'd never made for anyone in a decade. "The bad men are gone. Your mama is safe. You can come out now." Judy's lip trembled. Then she moved not toward him but deeper into her hiding place, her small frame trying to merge with the wall. "Are you the police?" "No." "Are you one of the bad men?" Nino considered the question. An honest answer would be complicated, nuanced, steeped in shades of gray that a 7-year-old shouldn't have to navigate. So he simplified it to the only truth that mattered right now. "I'm the man who came when you called. I'm the one who promised." Something shifted in Judy's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the desperate willingness to believe that somewhere in the wreckage of this night, someone had actually kept their word. She crawled forward slowly, emerged from under the bed like a small animal testing whether the predators had truly left. When she stood, Nino could see the tear tracks on her cheeks, the way her whole body shook, the yellow dress wrinkled and damp with sweat and fear. He held out her pink phone. "You dropped this." Judy took it with trembling hands, clutched it to her chest like a lifeline. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and wrapped her thin arms around Nino's neck. The embrace was fierce, desperate, the kind of hug that held nothing back. She buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed not the quiet crying she'd been doing under the bed, but the full-body release of every terror she'd been holding inside. Nino froze. His arms hung at his sides, uncertain, unpracticed at this particular form of human contact. When had he last held a child? When had anyone trusted him enough to be this vulnerable, this open? The answer came immediately, unbidden. Lucia. 9 years ago, a lifetime ago. In a world before the walls went up and the doors locked and his heart became a fortress no one could breach. Slowly, carefully, he raised his arms and wrapped them around Judy's small frame, held her while she cried, let her tears soak into his expensive shirt that was already ruined with other people's blood anyway, made himself still, solid, present the anchor she needed in this moment when her world had tilted off its axis, and nothing made sense except that a stranger had kept a promise when everyone else had failed. From the living room came the sound of sirens. Distant at first, then closer, the wail of emergency vehicles converging on this address from multiple directions. Nino had made one call on his way up the stairs, a single text to a contact whose badge was as bought and paid for as the building's neglected maintenance. The message had been simple. Domestic violence in progress. Officer needs assistance. 1,847 Riverside Unit 3C. The kind of call that got priority response, that brought cops running with their hands on their weapons and their radios crackling with urgency. They'd arrived to find 3 unconscious men, one with a shattered hand, all with outstanding warrants that Dante had helpfully uncovered and forwarded to the responding officers' databases. They'd find a woman with a broken arm who'd finally be free of the debt that had enslaved her. They'd find a little girl who'd be traumatized but alive, who'd have therapy ahead of her but also a future that yesterday she might not have been guaranteed. Nino made sure Silas would never hurt anyone again. Justice was served, cold and hard, delivered not by a system that had abandoned this neighborhood years ago, but by a man who understood that sometimes the only way to stop monsters was to become something they feared more. Comment, I stand for justice below. If you're glad the bad guy got what he deserved, let's flood the comments with positivity. Your mama needs a doctor, Nino said quietly, his voice rumbling in his chest where Judy's ear pressed against him. The ambulance is almost here. Can you be brave a little longer? Judy nodded against his shoulder but didn't let go. Nino stood, lifting her with him effortlessly. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her arms still tight around his neck, and he carried her that way back through the hallway, past the bedroom where nightmares lived, into the living room where Elena sat exactly where he'd left her. Elena's eyes found her daughter and she sobbed relief and anguish mixed together. The sound of a mother who'd been helpless to protect her child and was only now processing that they'd both survived. Nino crossed to her, knelt down carefully, and let Judy transfer from his arms to her mother's good one. They clung to each other, Elena pressing kisses into Judy's hair, whispering prayers and apologies and promises in Spanish that mixed with English in the universal language of maternal love. The siren screamed to a stop outside. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Nino stood, retrieved his Glock from where he'd left it, and moved toward the door before anyone could ask questions he didn't want to answer. He paused at the threshold, looked back at Elena and Judy huddled together on the floor amid the wreckage of their apartment and the unconscious bodies of their tormentors. The debt is paid, he said. Not a question, a statement, an order delivered with the weight of someone whose word was law in places the law forgot. Anyone comes asking, you tell them Nino Valentin said it's settled. Understand? Elena nodded, her eyes wide. She understood. Even in this forgotten corner of the city, that name carried weight, carried consequences, carried the promise of protection that was more reliable than any police patrol or restraining order. Nino disappeared down the stairs as the first officers burst through the building's front entrance. He moved like smoke, like shadow, using exits and angles he'd memorized on the way in. By the time the cops reached the third floor, he was already in his car, the Audi's engine purring to life, the night swallowing him whole as if he'd never been there at all. The drive back to the penthouse passed in silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the hum of expensive machinery and the ribbon of streetlights unwinding through the darkness. Nino's hands were steady on the wheel, his breathing even, his exterior as composed as it had been before the first text arrived. But inside, in that dead space where Lucia's memory lived, something had shifted. Not healed, that wound would never heal, but shifted, like a bone that had set wrong and finally cracked back into proper alignment. The penthouse welcomed him with its familiar emptiness. Floor-to-ceiling windows, city lights, expensive furniture arranged with the precision of a showroom because no one actually lived here, they just existed between one crisis and the next. Nino crossed to his desk, the mahogany surface clear except for 2 phones. The main one, handling business. The encrypted one, still showing the text thread that had started this entire night. He should delete it. Should erase the evidence, scrub the conversation, return to the isolation that had kept him safe for 9 years. That was the smart play, the professional move. Instead, Nino opened the contact settings. Where the number had displayed as just digits anonymous, Temporary, meaningless, he typed 2 words and saved them. The only one that matters. His finger hovered over the delete button for the conversation itself. All those messages, the desperate pleas, his promises, the proof that for one night, he'd been something other than the shadow of the East Coast, something other than a ghost who commanded fear and delivered death. He didn't delete it. Nino set the phone down, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey from the decanter that had sat untouched earlier, and stood at the window looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, in a hospital bed by now, a little girl in a yellow dress was safe. Her mother's arm would heal. The nightmares would fade, eventually, the way all nightmares did when you survived them and kept living anyway. And on a pink phone somewhere in that hospital, his last message would still be visible. Just 3 words. Simple, direct, true. I'm on my way. Nino Valentine had built an empire on broken promises and calculated violence, on knowing when to strike and when to disappear, on being the thing everyone feared but no one could touch. He'd convinced himself that isolation was strength, that caring was weakness, that the only way to survive was to become untouchable. Tonight, a wrong number had taught him different. Tonight, he'd learned that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was show up for someone who had no reason to believe anyone would come. That sometimes keeping a promise to a stranger mattered more than every carefully constructed wall you'd built to keep the world at arm's length. The whiskey burned going down. The city sprawled beneath him, indifferent and infinite, full of tragedies he couldn't fix and injustices he'd never hear about. But somewhere in that vastness, one little girl would remember that when she called for help in her darkest moment, someone answered, someone came, someone kept their promise. And that, Nino thought as he set down the empty glass, might be the closest thing to redemption a man like him would ever find.